Hi, everybody. Welcome back to LaraChat Live. We're on episode number 13. We apologize to reviewers for the last, let's say, month or so, where we've been burdened by our own overtime and work tasks. As you can see, some of our regulars, Mike and Matt, they're in client meetings and they couldn't make it today. Riz slept in, so he's on his way. He's just brushing his hair right now. We got a couple new guys, Eric, Thomas, and Dan. So we'll introduce them and let them talk about who they are, why they're here. The topic of our show today is going to be PHP 7, which some of these guys have some experience with, and will take us through the wide world of PHP 7, what's awesome and great, and maybe what's not so great about it. So first and foremost, I'd like to introduce Dan. Tell us about yourself.
Cool. I'm Danny for everybody. I'm currently the lead developer at a website called lawline.com, which is a website for professionals to do continuing education for the licenses, for attorneys and accountants to pretty much keep up with their state bar and such. Love PHP. Started with Ruby a few years ago, and pretty much have been loving code ever since. Between work, I do a bunch of side projects. I've been working with buddy Sean to develop DevOps.jobs, which is a marketplace for DevOps professionals to find their job. And pretty much been working with a bunch of developers in different side projects. That's pretty much it.
And one thing I wanted to mention about the DevOps job site, we were talking about having a widget placed on LaraChat's sister site, DevOps Chat. So hopefully soon there'll be a job section on DevOps Chat where you guys can share some of the latest DevOps-based jobs. It makes me wonder if I should reach out to the LaraJobs guy and do the same, ask him if he'd be willing to do the same thing, but we'll see.
Yeah, a few more days and I'll get that widget to you. I'm a little late, but a little busy.
Yeah, you said you'd have that done a week ago, didn't you?
Yeah.
And beyond that, we've got two fellows from PHP Ugly, the podcast out there, another PHP podcast. I enjoy them. Brought them on board, so I'd like to introduce Eric and Thomas. So let's start with Eric. Eric, how are you and who are you?
Hey, how you doing? Yeah, I'm Eric Van Johnson. I'm a PHP developer. I run a little development shop down here with my partner John Congdon. We mainly do PHP development. We do some system ops. It's called Diego Dev if anybody's interested. We specialize obviously in Laravel. That's kind of our sweet spot. We also run the local PHP user groups here in San Diego and the Laravel user group here in San Diego. That's pretty much me. I'm Shokum on Twitter if anybody's interested, SHOCM, and yeah, that's it. I totally forgot. And phpugly.com.
Yeah.
We have a podcast, PHP Ugly.
Can you tell me a bit about some of the topics on PHP Ugly? Is it a wide range, or do you talk about ugly things in PHP only?
No, it's a pretty wide range. It's basically myself, Thomas, who's on the show with you, and my business partner, John Congdon. We basically just sit down and talk about whatever interests us that week. Obviously, we're all PHP developers. We're all heavily focused in Laravel. We try to touch on PHP and Laravel topics every week, but the topics range. I mean, whatever's geeking us out that week. Problems with clients or whatever we're working on. Tech news that's going on. We do a lot of talking of just random stuff, and yeah, it's just fun. It was funny. We do a pregame before our user group meetups, and we have these conversations. And somebody just mentioned to Thomas and I was like, you know what, you guys really need a podcast, and just you guys should have these conversations but record them. So we decided to do that.
That's cool.
The important part is that the ugly is Eric and I, not PHP itself. We don't discuss PHP in a negative way at all.
That is an important. Yes, that's a very important distinction to make. We're the ugly in PHP Ugly.
That's what I thought. That's really cool. I'm curious about the turnout for you guys' meetup group.
Yeah, we run hot and cold. So we have two PHP user groups. So we're based here in San Diego, which is Southern California. I mean, where our county is right on the border of Mexico, and San Diego County itself is a pretty large county. So every month we have two PHP user groups, one in downtown San Diego, one in North County San Diego. And again, attendance ranges on topics and what's the time of year, but we'll pull in anywhere between 20 to 35 people at a meeting. Then our Laravel meetup we have once a month, and we try to centralize it into in the middle of the county. And again, same thing. We're pulling in probably 15 to 20 people a meetup, but we live stream that one as well, so that's fun. We had last night we did a live stream, and when I looked at it this morning, we had like 100 views on that live stream. So
That's awesome. And last but not least, before I get to Thomas, I should say welcome Riz. Everybody knows Riz. He finally made it. Looks like his hair isn't brushed. Let's get a close up here. Yeah, it's a bit messy. So last but not least, we've got Thomas. One of the, like you mentioned, he's part of PHP Ugly. And I actually was watching I forget the name of it, but it was your talk about Git. I thought
Git good.
Yeah, it was a really interesting talk. I would encourage people to check it out. Send me the link before the end of the show, and I'll tweet it out to everybody, and we can share it with our masses, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
So tell us a bit about you.
I've been a PHP developer for somewhere around 18, 19 years now. I work for a CMS company producing back-end systems to manage content, and that's pretty much all I've ever done is just content management stuff. I do work with Eric, and we work together on the 2 meetups that we run and our podcast.
Awesome. So now we talked about, we've introduced you guys, and our topic today is PHP 7. But before we get into that, we've got some daily news, or not daily, we're not daily, some news updates, which I'll pass it over to Riz. There's a lot of stuff that we've that have happened in the past months that we've kind of been offline with LaraCon Europe, 5.3, etc. There's a whole bunch of stuff. So pass it over to Riz to kind of share some of the cool things. And if any of you guys know of any cool news that we should share with the members, and that just shout it out and take it away, Riz.
Ooh, good morning, guys. Where do I start with the news? So much going on. Yeah, we've been off the air for like a month now, I think, and there's actually been a lot going on. I guess it's not really enough to not say that LaraCon has just passed, both LaraCons, I believe, and also Laravel 5.3 is out. Hey, Sean, when are we going to cover 5.3? Is that going to be today? Or
we can
should I go into it? Okay, anyway, 5.3, it has all this cool new Echo stuff. It's one of the most interesting updates I've seen in the Laravel because it's one of the more innovative ones, and I'm really looking forward to talking about that more. We also have a whole bunch of new updates regarding how. Okay, I think this is gonna have to have its own little segment later on. But Laravel is adding a new certification system. I don't know if we'll be covering that separately, but it's gonna be a big deal. It's gonna be a big debate, which I'm not sure we're going to really go into today either. We might want to get some people on board about that. Laravel is basically adding a system where we can get. It's a normal certification system, right? But this one is actually run by Sean McCool, who used to be a big proponent for adding complex DD systems into our Laravel applications. Very interesting stuff. I know very well some of the guys who build it. We don't know its pricing. We don't know its details. You can look. It's over on Laravel.com, and there's this little sexy video Taylor and the gang made to talk about it. check it out. I don't really know how that's going to work out, but details are coming out soon. I'm sure there's going to be more news coming out of Laravel, Laracon EU coming out soon. Stay tuned for that. And I think that's actually I'm gonna stay specific to the Laravel topics because between Laravel 5.3 and Laravel certification, there's pretty much already a lot to talk about. I think so. We can cover those. We can come back to those again later. I think, Sean.
Sure, no problem. One of the other things, PHP 7.1 is in beta 3, but it kind of segued into our main topic is PHP 7. Personally, I am using PHP 7 on Homestead, but I haven't spent a lot of time looking at what's new, what's different, what's good, what's bad. We got some of these other guys, Eric, Thomas, and Dan, and Riz, if you know much about PHP 7, shout it out. I'm curious, I know that a lot of us in the Laravel community, we use Forge and probably DigitalOcean or Amazon where we set up the servers ourselves. So we're not constrained to a host that is on 5.3 or, God forbid, 5.1 and all those older ones. So I'm curious, what would be the main reason to upgrade? I'm curious.
Yeah, performance, definitely hands down performance.
Yeah, that's the first big thing is how fast it is, because it's incredibly fast compared to 5.
Definitely your first most important thing is definitely performance. I mean, it's twice as fast.
So there's the Facebook HVMM, I think it is.
Yeah.
Do we need that anymore, or would you consider using a service like that?
Sorry, continue.
Sorry. Even Facebook isn't using that at this point. They've gone on to a private version of the HHVM that they're now basing everything off of. But really, it rivals all of the compiled special versions at this point in speed. I wouldn't see any reason to throw compatibility under the bus for the sake of having HHVM.
Yeah, I totally agree. When PHP 7 came out, and I heard about these big performance increases, and they were saying how they were comparable, if not faster, than HHVM, I decided to do a few benchmark tests when I had like a few different little Vagrant boxes and a few different pieces that I could kind of test, just PHP 5.5, PHP 5.6, PHP 5.6 with HHVM, and then PHP 7. And honestly, PHP 7 blew out of the water, obviously, naturally, PHP 5.6. And even with HHVM, it was faster in some respects, pretty much comparable in other respects. It really depends on what you're doing. But the fact that it's up there with native PHP is huge. Definitely big shout out to the PHP people to actually, put in the time and actually care enough about the community to, hook us up like that. Yeah, it's definitely a lot faster.
So when it comes to some of the new features, what are some of the cool toys that we get to play with in version 7?
Yeah, so I was actually surprised how little there was. I was excited initially about some of the things that I saw coming down, specifically things like, what was it? The only one that keeps coming to mind is the spaceship operator, and I don't have a use for that yet. I want to use it just to put it in my code, but I don't actually have a good use case for it yet.
Yeah, I'm exactly the same boat.
I thought I was going to be more excited. I thought I was going to use the return type declaration a little more, but I'm not. The one thing I did catch myself doing, I just did a presentation on Laravel 5.3 for Laravel group last night, and I did catch myself utilizing the grouping of use cases. So having your use when you using multiple traits, you can now group them all in one line. So you can use trait 1, trait 2. I did catch myself doing that, and then I realized, man, if I was running this on 5.3, this wouldn't actually work. So, but there hasn't been a lot of stunning new features that I found myself where I have to use it.
I use one feature very frequently, which is the null coalescing operator, and that's the double question mark. So it used to be that if you wanted to have a ternary where you were looking at a posted value and using it if it was set, and if it wasn't set, then printing out some kind of default. Well, now the null coalescing operator checks for is set and uses the default. So it would just be $_post and then user in an array, and then double question mark and then Tom. So if there was no user variable in the post, or if there was no user key in the post array, then it would just return Tom. Otherwise, it would return whatever was set in the array. I use that all the time. It's super handy, and it's an excellent short replacement for ternaries, which can be very hard to understand once they get right in the middle of stuff.
I actually have a particular way of explaining PHP 7, which I really like. Basically, PHP is a language that acts the way you want it to act, right? So if you treat it like Java, where you want to have type hints for everything and all that type safety, you can have that. If you prefer flexible stuff like Ruby style or like JavaScript style, you can have that. So PHP 7, in a nutshell, you like Haskell? It has generators. You like JavaScript? You can now bind your closures to a context, similar to how you can do that with JavaScript when you bind a context to a closure. If you like Java, you have your Scholar type hints and you have your return types. If you like PHP, you have your null coalescence because you like your nulls, right? I think that summarizes most of PHP 7 right there. And on top of that, the really big one, which I love in particular, is they have a new lexer in PHP 7, which means you can now do simple things like, weirdly enough, in old PHP, if you do something like you do a statement in parentheses and then do a : static method, it would often fail because it doesn't understand it has to parse the parentheses first and then call the static on it. In PHP 7, they actually have a new lexer where you can do that, which is why now you can just do parentheses new something and then call something on it. It's actually very complicated, and in some ways it's a bit backwards compatibility breaking, but it's my single favorite new thing in PHP 7.
Nice. Yeah, I'm also a big fan of the null coalesce operator. I mean, like, starting in Ruby, I love the idea of being able to have like short, concise, like checking, and be able to have it really just not have to put boilerplate for simple things that everybody wants to do. Like, you're gonna, chances are you're gonna have to check for nulls or certain things. Like, yeah, you can write your code in certain ways where you have more of a, object-oriented. You have things where you have to check for less, but even still, at the end of the day, it's just such a nice syntactic sugar that's just really great to have. Huge fan.
I think one of the things that sort of gets looked aside by a lot of developers is the scalar type declarations, the return type declarations. As Eric was saying, I don't think the day-to-day developer uses those a whole lot. But if you're producing a library that's going to be used in something or something where people are using your code to write their own code, it's very, very nice to have your IDEs auto-filling and telling you that doesn't work, that's an int, that doesn't work, that's an array, or trying to return something that's going to be returning null or void and not returning what you expect. So it's helpful for developers to start getting code that was written for PHP 7 from frameworks like Laravel and Symfony, where they basically say, yeah, this is going to return an array. This is going to. So it's one of those changes you're going to see improvement over time when people start dropping support for the 5.3s and the 5.6 branches. Once that support starts to go away, then you'll see support for these functions come in to play a lot more, and it's just a general forward movement in the language.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think, like, in general, like, people strive, like, PHP community is going towards more readable code. You want your code to be a lot quicker to understand. Like, the whole point to me of, like, Laravel in general is this is way cleaner code, and just bootstrapping your old code igniter framework. So the idea of PHP giving you things that allow you to consume your code much quicker, knowing what the type is going to be just by reading the function declaration, to me is just a huge win. It also is great for somebody who works in, let's say, a very large code base. Let's say you're a developer who doesn't write every piece of code. You work on a fairly large team, to be able to know what you're actually expecting and writing new functions. Let's say if you're working on, let's say, implementing a similar interface, you know what to return, what types, what your things are going to look for. It's great to be able to fit in much nicer without having to sit there and just read a whole bunch of other code. You can just get right to it. So I'm actually a big fan of the whole return types thing. Like, I like the freedom of PHP. Like, Java's very restrictive. Like, you have to do all these things. PHP kind of gives you the options. They're like, hey, you want to do that? Cool. If not, like, you're fine. Like, I'm the type of person where I work at a company where we have one code base, and it's not huge, but it's fairly large. Like, tons of models, tons of repos. Like, it becomes a lot to where if you're a new developer coming onto the team, or if you're a person who just hasn't worked on a particular feature, it's great to have literally the code document itself.
One of the things that's coming up too with PHP 7.1, because I had mentioned void return types, but remembered, yeah, void return types are the one thing that's missing from 7.0. And with 7.1, we're getting the void return type, which means I'm not going to return anything at all. There's not a return on this function. So with that, we're at least going to have a feature complete return type system now.
Nice. I didn't know that.
I was actually just looking at the PHP 7 documentation page, and actually left off with one of the cool things that seemed, well, I don't know what to think about it, but the same function cannot have multiple parameters with the same name. I had no idea this was possible in older versions of PHP. Like, the example has a function with parameter $A, $B, and $unused and $unused. Like, I had no idea about that. Kind of interesting that was even allowed in the first place.
Yeah, there's been a lot of fixes in 7.0. You know, if you go through the RFCs, you'll see some interesting, sort of scary ones that were included in 7.0. One of them is fixing for each functionality, which, if you've ever relied on it, then shame on you, but it is one of the most breaking things if you did rely on it, because the for each behavior, the way it moves through the current key and the way it uses passed by reference variables can get very screwy. And in 7.0, that's been flat out fixed. So there's a lot of small behind the scenes tweaks that took place that bring PHP 7 more into reality.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, I tend to find that there's some hate towards the PHP community in regards to not being an official programming language. And I know I've had some, I was at a tech recruiting fair a couple years ago, and we were recruiting new developers, and they would come up, and they're fresh out of school, learning the latest in Ruby and whatnot, and they come up and they're like, "Oh yeah, what's your stack?" And we say, "Well, we're PHP. At the time we used the Yi framework, and we were transitioning into Laravel." And we talked to them about that, and then they would talk about, well, PHP is not a real language, blah blah blah, and sometimes you just kind of want to.
You give me their names. You give me their names. I'll tell them. No. Yeah, I think as a PHP developer, you definitely have to build up a pretty thick skin.
Yeah, and one of the awesome things is, like, for me, I'm 6'7". I'm a hockey player. I hurt myself. Like, I play aggressively, but in that kind of situation, I'm not the kind of person to get in people's faces. I'm like, that's your opinion, dude, whatever. But we had and she's one of the admins of LaraChat. She helped me start it up way back when. But she worked with me at the time, and she had no problem getting in these guys' faces and going like, well, PHP is actually a real language. It does this and this and this and all these things that you're doing in Ruby and Go and all that stuff. And she would just, she would battle with them, and it was awesome to watch. But I'm excited to hear people are kind of standing up for PHP and actually taking care in their development processes and not being the procedural developers that just. I mean, PHP came from a templating language. It's not a templating language anymore.
Right. That's usually my thing. My go-to lately has been, and the reality of it is, I don't engage in that argument anymore. It's just not worth it. There's no reason for me to try to convince somebody the validity of PHP, but I will tell a real developer, somebody I can tell who has a skill, who might be misled about his interpretation of PHP, that if you haven't used PHP in the last 2 years, you can't talk about it. You have to give it another try. I mean, since things like the PSRs started up, where everybody started to agree on some standards and implementations. You hit PHP 5.3, now 7.0. It's just the whole landscape has changed, and real developers will understand that. But they've had no reason to go back into PHP. They might have done PHP, back in high school or early college, and they had that impression, and they haven't been into it recently. And so I do encourage true developers to give it another look if you haven't in the last couple of years. But it's funny because I'm always in this weird spot, because as a community leader and user group organizer, you want to encourage people to give PHP a try and to look at it and work with it. But as somebody who runs a business who does PHP development, the fewer people in the market, the better for me, because PHP isn't going anywhere. So the fewer developers out there, yay me!
Yeah, I think a lot of the PHP hate comes from an article that was written in 2012 called PHP, a Fractal of Bad Design. And the thing is, so many people who've been developing for a long time got that article, read it, agreed with some or all of it, but it's not reflective of where PHP is nowadays. Things like MySQL real escape string being used in that article, that's not a thing anymore. That's not what we do. Missing methods that are actually fixed now, things like that. It's the arguments don't stand up the way they used to.
Yeah. I wanted to make a note on Eric's comment about the fewer PHP developers. I mean, LaraChat has, 13,000 users now? So you got 13,000 people there to compete with. It's only a fraction of the community, though.
Yeah. But to go back to the hate, I do understand, when I first started learning PHP, when I was coming over from Ruby, because that's the job that I was taking, was a PHP job. And I definitely felt frustrations, and the people that I was learning from, or the code that I was seeing, was just bad PHP code. And I think PHP itself gets a bad rap because of bad use cases, just bad code out there. PHP is a little bit old, and it has so many bad things from the past that people dwell on. They don't like to look to the future. They don't like to hear about things that are actually changing for the positive. And once I actually started, playing around with Laravel and seeing there actually is, a very nice and elegant way to actually structure PHP and actually use it, that to me actually is very similar to how Ruby on Rails is implemented. To me, when I first stumbled on Laravel, I was like, wow, this is the Rails of PHP. This is awesome. This totally flipped the script for me when I saw it. So it's coming from a few different viewpoints. And so now I started engaging in open arms, and the more good code you read of PHP, you see how much of it is discoverable and how much you can actually learn from it, as opposed to certain other languages where it to dig through a lot of stuff to even see how they're being implemented. So I really do the more I use PHP, the more I like it, because I'm keeping an open mind, And the past few years now, I've been strictly PHP, and I gotta say, I mean, especially thanks to Laravel, but it's been very pleasurable to work with PHP and Laravel as opposed to, I don't know, the alternatives.
And I would be curious, Dan, your take on this. and I think something we've seen in the market over the last year or two, especially, is that some of these other platforms that have really kind of stepped up as a replacement for PHP has started to fall out of graces. I mean, Rails, for example, I know that was it. That was what was going to replace PHP. It was Rails, the Rails framework, because they were kind of a solid framework when PHP really didn't have the concept of what a framework was. There's Cake PHP. There are a few out there, but Rails, Ruby nailed it with Rails.
Yeah.
But they've gone through some growing pains, and I know it's fallen out of grace with a lot of developers where they're just flat out stopping development in Ruby anymore because of it.
Yeah, so I do agree with you. I think like Ruby had a great draw because it has a lot of syntactic sugar and it was very very expressive in syntax. And before Laravel, like you were used to literally wrapping your functions where they went out like this because it started to move. Whereas everything in Ruby was objects, right? Strings an object, arrays an object. Everything is like dot notation similar to JavaScript. So it's very natural feeling. Laravel kind of went above and beyond and said, wait a second, this is a thing here, and let's work towards that paradigm. And it really shifted a lot to the point where the advantages of Ruby as a syntax were no longer that much of it didn't outweigh it nearly as much as the, let's say, the server side, right? Where Ruby is a little more of a pain to maintain, it's a little bit more of a pain to deploy, to where people are going back to PHP because it's such a simple thing to host. Like Taylor Atwell said, he's like, well, the reason I chose PHP is because it's just so easy to host. Like there's literally anyone can pick it up, start a web server, and literally start learning from the documentation and create an app. Whereas Ruby, you might be able to learn on localhost, but one of my teachers once told me is you're not a web developer until it's on the internet. Localhost doesn't mean nothing.
Yeah, and there's definitely some pain points when doing upgrades with Ruby and Rails. Trying to keep those versions correct is an issue, and it's not only a Ruby issue. The upgrade for Python from 2.7 to 3 has been a brutal step for that community.
Yeah.
And they're just getting to the point where Python 3 is becoming the standard, but I mean, you're talking, it's been like a 2 or 3 year effort to get people off of 2.7. It's terrible.
Yeah.
And, on that note, before we started talking, I looked it up. Do you guys know what the adoption rate for PHP 7 is right now?
I would imagine very high because it was painless for me.
According to Composer's stats in May of this year, it was 20%, which if you consider the adoption rate from 4 to 5 when it occurred, it was slow. I've been really impressed by how successfully 7 has taken off within the community. There was a huge delay with getting 6 together to the point that it basically burned before it reached production. But when the internals team said, we're going to do this 7, we're going to make it right, we're going to release it and have it be a real thing, they just did everything right, got on all gears and pushed it out, and the community really grabbed at it and took it.
And one thing I wanted to point out, going back to on the Ruby on Rails kind of thing in comparison to Laravel, a company I worked at, we had a junior developer come in who had a Rails background, and we were sitting in a meeting, and he's saying to the stakeholders of the company, like, oh man, we got to be on Rails, it's faster, it does this and this and this, and so he would say it does, I can't even remember, a while ago, maybe a year or two, but he was saying it does X, Y, Z, and I say, well, yeah, PHP does that, but Ruby on Rails does this, and I say, well, Laravel does that, and it was just like on and on, like PHP and Laravel, they were competing with Rails and Ruby on Rails as the framework. It felt good.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the big thing about Ruby on Rails, at least when I was learning it, was the strength was in numbers, right? It was the community behind Rails. You can really learn from the community. They had, what's called Railscast was huge. It was just a very, very clean, easy way to learn web development.
Very open and welcoming. Yeah.
Exactly. And it had the whole third-party library system with the whole gems. Was very popular. That was the mindset. Was don't reinvent the wheel. Do it. Whereas I've worked for some PHP bosses where they're like, all right, we're doing everything ourselves. we're doing it all again, and I'm just like, why? If something is already tried and tested. Sean, I know you and I have spoken about this before. Like, perfect example was like Carbon. Like, Carbon's great, it's tested, it's a great. Why should I reinvent the datetime, parser if I can just use something amazing and just pull it in with Composer?
That's
And
a great point. Yeah, yeah. That was one of the things. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but
no, please.
you just, I mean, that just great point. When I was doing some Rails work, the gems blew me away. Composer is our gems, and
Yeah, it
that
is.
just changed the entire playing field for PHP. So not only did our language get better, but the introduction of Composer and being able to do things very similar to what Rails does with gems, what NPM does. Every other basic programming language out there has their package management system. Now that we had one that was good, I mean, we had Pair before, but we tried to forget about Pair, right?
Yeah.
Composer was done right, and that just absolutely changes everything. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, I do.
Now-
Sorry, I do remember before trying, let's say, the early days of GitHub and looking up some other PHP packages and thinking, oh my God, this is awesome, I need to use this. And pre-Composer days, they would have their own way of including it into your project, and maybe it didn't work because it didn't fit with the way you structured it, so I love the idea behind Composer where Composer require and it works. I mean, what more can you say than it works?
Yeah, now I think the Rails community needs to get its own version of Jeffrey Way if they want to compete with us.
Yeah, he is my idol.
He is an incredible resource. I mean, he's taken just a vast amount of the knowledge that this community has and made it available in 3-minute and 5-minute bites, and really just incredibly understandable. I think he's one of the biggest contributions to PHP in recent years outside of PHP 7 and Composer.
Absolutely, I totally agree. I mean, like, after watching Jeffrey, after signing up to LaraCasts, I feel like I straight up leveled up 5 levels. After watching him, he just blew me away with some of the fundamentals. Just going back to roots PHP. What are you doing? Let's structure this as object. You don't even need a framework. Yeah, it's nice. Laravel does give us all these options, but PHP actually gives us the opportunity to write clean, object-oriented, expressive code that really does document itself. The question is just, are you using the tools that you have, or are you just following anti-patterns that you're just used to?
Yeah, and it's really saying something when you've been developing for 15 years and then a 3-minute clip makes you go, oh, okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense now.
I actually think that's a
Yeah,
big.
absolutely.
This is an important part of why PHP 7 is a big deal, I think, and it connects all of these dots we've been talking about so far. PHP 7 is big because it breaks a lot of stuff. Well, it doesn't break. It builds on top of a lot of stuff which people took for granted from old PHP. Old PHP, like PHP 4, PHP 3, ancient PHP, has what I call Microsoft Office syndrome, where they want to get rid of a lot of old features, but if they do, they're going to lose a lot of developers who don't understand how to use the better ones. That's why when they introduced new classes and the new object-oriented system in PHP 5, they were scared of changing things because, oh no, what about people who can't do object-oriented? And it's true, there were people screaming, I don't like PHP being so object-oriented, I like it functional. But at the end of the day, I think one of PHP's biggest strengths is it's a straightforward, no fuss, C-style web programming language that's easy to install, has good support, is fairly secure if you use it right. And they just had to get rid of that baggage. They just had to get rid of the stuff which people relied on for backwards compatibility. And PHP 7 is where they drew that line. They said, guys, if you want to write outdated, broken, vulnerable code, stay on 5.3. And if you are ready to move forward, and they decided we don't need these newbie developers who are trying to use PHP without Composer, for example. If you want to be a PHP developer nowadays, you need to use Composer, you need to use latest versions, you need to understand how to use a command line. That's just how the world is nowadays, and the PHP devs realize that. And so that's what PHP 7 is. It's a cleanup. They're trying to fix things which were just there because they used to be. Like, for a perfect example, if you guys can see this properly, this is the new uniform variable syntax, just for the benefit of our viewers. It changes some of these. Most of this is sensible. Like, you see this syntax here, which is like straight out of JavaScript. JavaScript does this all the time. But this was not possible before PHP 7. And a lot of people who are used to programming, especially like C programmers or basically any programming language where sensible syntax should quote-unquote just work, PHP 7 makes it finally work. But you'll see here there is some breaking changes down here. These have to do with variables. And this is, you don't really use these very often nowadays anyway. So if you use code normally, right, it's just, this is just, I've just seen code break because of this, funny enough. People who use these little, they call a dynamic variable. But there are better ways of doing this kind of code nowadays. You can use the call user function, that kind of thing. Same with the context-sensitive Lexer. This is another change in PHP 7, which, if you ever wondered why Laravel uses arrow lists instead of list, because you couldn't use the list with an S before, because it's a reserved keyword, even though it's never used for a function or a method. It's because it's a keyword for a language, for a control flow, I believe. Yeah, it's for setting multiple variables at once. So PHP 7 finally lets you use like for each as a function name, which is crazy sometimes. And this is actually a thing that PHP has above other languages at times. Also, Sean, just to answer a question earlier, yes, you can have the same variable appear twice. This is a backwards compatibility thing from old, I think, PHP 3, I think, and it'll actually use the latest one. This lets you like change out a function signature. But anyway, PHP 7 is a big deal, and what I want to know from you guys now is, I've been talking to a lot of developers lately, and many of them are still in 5.3. Yes, a lot of them have moved to 7, but a good deal are still on 5.3, 5.4, 5.5, or 5.6, under the idea of, you know how it goes, right? The company is saying, we don't have time to upgrade. We don't have time to test. We don't have a test suite. I know it's your fault, but they're saying we're not ready yet. And I understand that a lot of old PHP versions are already off of support. A whole bunch of them just are no longer getting updates at all. How critical do you guys think it is to upgrade to PHP 7 now, especially because it has backwards compatibility changes?
It's massively critical. Every big company I know of made the switch rather quickly, because the first thing it does is cut your server costs in half. It's fast to the point where it pays to do the work. I mean, it really pays. If you've got a lot of servers running large loads, heavy user counts, PHP 7 gives you money, almost for free. Give it 2 days of migration testing and stuff like that, but it really is a moneymaker because of how much faster it is. And because of the adoption rate, you're seeing the older versions, 5.3 and I think 5.4, just got dropped off of the security updates list at this point. So it's now's the time to do it. And there are plenty of reasons that people will give, plenty of excuses, but they're just excuses.
I don't know if I completely agree with you, Thomas. I mean, I do think that there's a critical path to get to PHP 7, and you need to minimize the excuses that are out there. But when you start talking about enterprise environments and monolithic applications, it's not that simple, and it never is. Things just move so much slower, and that's if you do have unit tests in place. I think it's pretty common. I mean, it's not only a PHP 5.3 to 7 upgrade issue. It's just a general practice of upgrading and for enterprise that when these big version changes come out, yes, that's what you target for new systems, but you don't like to disturb the application that is producing for you too much if not needed. So where I do agree with you that there needs to be an concerted effort to make that move, and I question whether or not how much of a return you'll see in that move. I understand your argument about performance and the need for servers. The real-world scenario, especially for enterprises, is things just don't move that quickly.
Well, I will say, if you are on an unsupported version now, so if you're not getting security updates, then you're completely crazy, because with the way security works, you're going to get compromised very, very quickly, and it's not going to be a website defacing issue. You're going to get compromised in a way that you can't tell you've been compromised, and that's just going to happen. There was very recently a big hack at Pornhub. I'm sorry, not a hack. It was a challenge, a bug finding challenge, which showed that non-updated versions of PHP have massive security holes. They're difficult to take advantage of, but it can definitely be. It's very important to stay up to date on security at the very, very least.
Yeah,
I think as a developer, that should be part of your job responsibilities, your education. You should understand some of those things at the very least. One of the things I wanted to point out, I was looking for while everybody was talking, there's a site called phpversion.info, and it's hosted by Phil Sturgeon. We all know him from his book, How to Build APIs You Won't Hate, and his vast opinions about the framework or language. And on that site, it has, I'll pull it up into the share my screen here. Let me, you know what, I won't do that right now.
That's trippy.
We need to go deeper.
Anyway, phpversion.info, and it shows like shared hosts and managed hosts and who has what version on their system. And I do recall seeing Phil point out on Twitter, I think it was, call out some of these hosts, like, hey, you guys are on a really insecure. Like I see one of these people here. I don't want to call them out, but they're on 5.3.29, and I mean, security is concerned with all these hosts. So, so Phil's doing, I think, a good job there, calling out some of these hosts, trying to get them to upgrade. Otherwise, I think some of them might have these opinions of, PHP sucks. Why should I upgrade to 7? But so good on him for that. Riz pulled it up.
This is terrifying, Sean. Look at all these people on 5.3.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know what it is, though? I think it comes down to your situation. Like, I know certain people who are like, hey, I want to upgrade. They tell people who, maybe they don't have the authority to do it, and they're like, no, we're not going to do it. People, non-technicals who are maybe in the position to make decisions they shouldn't be making. When it comes to enterprise, that's very common, I've found, to where, certain people just don't get their voices, certain developers don't get their voices heard. Also, when we switched from 5.6 to 7, that was pretty easy. Switching from 5.3 to 7, I think it takes a lot more work, to the point where it's all a cost-benefit analysis. Yes, it came off security updates. All right, that's a bigger deal. When they were on 5.6 and 5.3 was still being supported, I would make the argument to upgrade, but at the same time, it really depends on your environment, and I feel like easier said than done. As much as I want to say, hey, let's just go on the upgrade train. I try and keep our system at the current company on the upgrade train. We constantly, I quote one of my, the previous lead developer called it the upgrade treadmill. You're just constantly climbing that treadmill, because it's, sure enough, one of the packages you're using, as we noted earlier with Composer, you're going to start using a lot of stuff, and whether it's PHP or something else, people are getting major releases. Development is totally hot right now. So it's work, and I guess some bosses see it as, well, is it a little bit of a server cost that's pennies in the dollar from AWS, or is it developer time that I pay so much money for?
Yeah, I want to make a quick note before we head into our Q&A. There was a talk I was watching by Anthony Ferreira at the PHP Northwest conference in 2014. And I just started watching it today. I'm not through the full thing, but one of the things he talked about was the server cost in relation to developer costs. So I think there's a very valid point in doing that upgrade to PHP 7 for taking down the cost of a server. I'll share that link out on the Slack channel and Twitter once I get a chance. But I'd like to roll into our Q&A. So one of the first questions comes from our member Kobe Fielding. He wants to know about Riz's curtains.
What about my curtains? They're Lego City curtains from 1995.
What
They
are
are-
they? I can't.
Bruh, your curtains, bruh. What's up
Look.
with your curtains, bruh?
Look, yeah, they're Lego curtains from 1995. They are an old relic of mine, and I love Legos. That's talk for another day. I
Throwback.
do love Legos.
The question is, do the curtains match the sheets?
I actually have a Lego City blanket to match. Fortunately, it's not here right now.
I got an actual face palm out of the space there.
On behalf of PHP Ugly in general, I want to apologize for anything Tom says on this podcast. He does not represent PHP Ugly on any means. I apologize.
So another question, again by Kobe Fielding. Any good tutorials on upgrading Mac from PHP 5.5 to 7?
He said Mac specifically?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know of any tutorials, but if you use Brew makes it pretty simple.
Second that.
Yeah, and there was I'm trying to remember what it was called, but there was actually something. So Python has this this idea of being able to run multiple versions using virtual env, I think is what it's called. And there's a version of that for PHP where you can actually install multiple versions of PHP on your Mac and fire up whatever version it is you want to test against. The name escapes me. I'll try to Google it real fast, but yeah, if you're not using Brew to install your PHP stuff, because the stuff that comes with Mac in general is worthless. If that's what you're running, just install it with Brew. Brew will take care of the system default PHP install for you, and that's really the way you want to manage your PHP versions on a Mac.
I would also say that if you're using PHP servers on a Mac, you're probably doing it for development. You're probably not hosting off of a Mac server. So I would really endorse Valet, which is the new Laravel system for managing VMs and handling all of the Laravel install and Homestead stuff. And the new versions of Homestead do include PHP 7.
Cool.
Awesome. So another question, again by our favorite member, Kobe Fielding. What is the thought on single SPAs? What is that? Single page applications with using Laravel backend instead of other options. What are the common use cases? So one thing I'll address on this, when I think of using SPA, single page application, I like to have an API at the backend. So I'll use something like Vue.js, Angular, React, whatever, and I'll make API calls to Laravel API, Lumen API to get the data I need. That's the way I prefer to use it. What are your guys' experiences?
Yeah, at that point, I feel like it's whatever you're comfortable with. Like I prefer, I really like Laravel or Lumen, so it's pretty much you have a service architecture, right? So where the single page application, like you said, whether it's Angular or whatever, is just running services back from the API. So as long as the endpoint works, you're good. So for me, I like Laravel. It's very easy, it's very concise, it's quick, rapid. You know, with Laravel 5.3, I think they started working more of the API implementation into making it quicker and more cohesive. But at the end of the day, when you're building a single-page application with that architecture, the API is completely separate, whether it's your own homegrown one or it's from a third-party data source, whether it's it's like a Facebook API or a Twitter API or whatever. As long as your application has a data feed, it's really dealer's choice, in my opinion.
I completely agree with Dan. I mean, when you're talking about consuming APIs, you're no longer concerned about the platform it's running on, and there's absolutely no reason not to develop APIs using Laravel or Lumen. They're both fantastic backends. I'm not much of a front-end guy. I don't do a lot of front-end development, and I always had struggled with use cases for SPA websites. But I have to say, I recently developed one using Vue.js. Again, API calls to the back end, Vue.js on the front end. Vue.js almost has you forget that you're developing a single page application because you're still developing all these separate components that it's pulling in. And yeah, it's great. There's absolutely no reason not to use Laravel for any of your API needs.
So one of our other questions is any past experience that you guys have in upgrading PHP 5 sites to PHP 7?
Yeah, I remember when it first, like, when I first I saw actually, it's a little bit of an answer of both questions from the original, is I saw DigitalOcean had a decent upgrade guide for, like, people who had Ubuntu, and, I mean, I use a Vagrant environment with an Ubuntu box, but I would imagine it should be fairly similar as long as you just install the right packages with PHP 7. Like, it's pretty painless. Like, all I had to do is just like an apt-get install with like PHP 7 and just like a slew of extra packages like use Nginx, so FPM, and you make sure you get MB string and all the little packages that come along with it. And it's as far as just wiring up your vhosts and restarting Nginx and PHP, and you're kind of good to go. The only gotcha is that I had to purge all my PHP 5.6 stuff from the system because it was getting kind of confused. I don't know if it was me just having to figure it out, from the beginning, or maybe I made a misstep. But that was the only gotcha that I could think of. Everything else was pretty painless, honestly. Like, just install the right packages and just rewire it up and restart everything, and you're pretty good to go.
One more question from our LaraChat members, and I think Riz had some questions from his students. We're running a bit out of time, but last question again by Kobe. Should you set up JWT, JSON Web Tokens, with SPA, with Laravel and Vue? My opinion is yes, I think you should. Certainly, I mean, security is the right choice every time. What are your guys' opinions? JWT open APIs and restricted via Nginx or OAuth? Like, what do you got?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. JWT has made consuming APIs and authenticating APIs so much simpler. And if that is kind of your area of expertise or something you work in, you're going to be so excited with Passport. If you haven't looked at Laravel 5.3 and Passport, check it out. It becomes an OAuth server for you, but it also it does a bunch of there's a Vue JavaScript library to handle JWTs and things like that. Very exciting stuff. Very exciting.
So let's jump over to Riz for a couple of his questions. We'll do a couple quick ones before we sign off for the night.
I'll just do one really big one, I think. There is a question from one of my students that there are still some PHP libraries out there who use procedural code, who use functional or procedural code, who don't do objects, basically. There are some frameworks out there who use it mostly because they want to be quote-unquote fast. So instead of Laravel's all those classes, it'll have just a bunch of lines, some closures, basically like you're writing JavaScript, right? Here's the question. With the stuff coming in at 7.0, and as we talked about earlier, it's basically making a clean break from old PHP, right? Do you think there's still room? Like, now that PHP is adding all this strict typing with return types and type hints, do you think PHP from here on in is going to go all the way in that direction? And should people who still duck type their code be worried? Are people who still write procedural code, should they be worried because now everything's about classes and PHP is moving more and more in that direction? Do you think PHP 7 is indicative of how it's going, or is it just trying to clean itself up?
Well, I think the web development, generally speaking, lends itself to the MVC style of development. Because of that, because PHP is focused in web development, then object-oriented development is the way to continue working. Now, nothing is occurring in PHP 7 that's going to make procedural or functional programming not work, but I personally don't think that procedural or functional programming has a strong place in the PHP world. We like to focus a lot in our meetups about solid development, reusable code, dependency agnostic, stuff like that, where functional programming just isn't flexible enough to pull off what we needed to pull off. When we're writing something like a framework or a toolkit for somebody, we don't want to presume that they're running a specific version of MySQL. We don't want to presume that they're running MySQL at all sometimes. So the flexibility that's given to us by our MVC framework, which we get to have because of the object-oriented development, really pushes us in the direction of continued object-oriented development. I know there is a big movement right now for procedural code, for functional programming in languages like Go, but I can't necessarily tell if people are serious when they say, "Oh, OOP is the wrong thing to do. It's terrible. It's horrible." I don't see what it is they're seeing with horrible stuff coming out of the fact that something is object oriented.
Yeah, I kind of agree with a lot of what you're saying. I think like it really depends, like right tool for the job, you know? Like if you're in a business that is not really worried about having tons of users, you have this big application, but you're more focused on straight performance, grinding, doing let's say you know, some sort of data analysis or maybe some sort of financial application that's doing a ton of stuff on the back end, you know, where it's doing a lot of pulling in very large sets of data and it's running tons of like map reduce type stuff, then maybe PHP is not the answer for that, you know, and maybe a more functional programming approach is, or maybe a different language. But PHP, like you said, is geared towards web development, right? You're making a web application. You're making something that is to be, consumed by users on a website. It has common interactions that you're used to on the web, and for that, I think object-oriented does a great job of mimicking the real world, and that's really what we strive for as web developers, right? We try and make our code actually reflect what we experience in the real world, so it's a lot easier, more flexible to deal with. When you have tons of lines of procedural code, it becomes a lot harder to manipulate and change as the world changes, as your needs change. So I think PHP is going a little bit away from it, but that's because I think they're trying not to make everybody happy anymore, and they're trying to be like, okay, this is our opinion, we're a web development language, this is what we're doing, and we're trying to be more performant and better at it.
So guys, I think we'll have to wrap up there. Sean actually had to run in a hurry just now, so I'll do the honors of closing up. I'm not really sure how we're going to close the call actually when we're done, but we can figure that out later. So big thank you, you guys, Dan, Eric, Thomas. Thanks for hopping on, talking to us.
Thanks for having us. We appreciate being here.
Glad we could be here to make things ugly.
No, all beautiful people here today.
Yeah, thanks, man.
Okay. Thanks, guys. We'll see you around. Viewers will be back 2 weeks from now, hopefully. We'll keep you posted on the Slack channel. We'll talk to you guys later. Have a good night, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
See ya.
See ya.
Bye. Let me make a quick shout out to Salmon Shop and Voyant. I forgot to mention them earlier. Two great dev shops. One's DevOps, Voyant. One's Salmon Shop Development. Really smart guys. Sorry about not forgetting it earlier.
You owe him a beer.
Shameless plug.